obi akwaba e dia ba the Punch TV message so be share video e dia ma me ama foforo nya bi ahwe no hu ne yekoso e wo man Ghana ene ne circulate e wo social media no eso media ne akere broni de bia nsem no foforo ba na ba se de bia me de me ka me se ade ye che e be da be sore ya nti asem no na che se enye ti de bia nsem foforo ba na be ba social media no so ne ba the Punch TV ye de bibia e trodo ye be fa se video asem na nipa ne kan yo se de sitie na ene be ba be ka na emom no ye nyi bi mfrim ye mfa bi enka ho ekura it is a ope ensem de be twa go social media ne so ana de eje ne ho me na e wo media ne so aye no kura kwa de a meso so be me subscribe button ne so na subscribe to your YouTube channel no aye the Punch TV se de be ya e post video a onsusu be nya notification no ahwe bi e de ama me e ma were mfi so obe share video no obe like afi wadwen kire no waje no comment section hono e de ama me ama matimi aba be kenkan e de ama.
Attorney General's position is about corruption, in which they were looking at various institutions' corruption, and they were talking about Lands Commission, Judiciary, amongst the institutions which are perceived, as being, corrupt in the ways in which they function. Now, I think that we need to be very concerned, especially, like I said, if we are legal professionals, if we are the people in those judicial positions. And we all know, the ANAS investigations and what it led to in terms of, the image of the judiciary. So these issues, they are not just issues about image. They are also issues about the reality. What is the reality? ANAS uncovered certain real accounts of corrupt practice by judges. And as people say, that was only the tip of the iceberg. So we should be concerned enormously about that. And we should find ways in which to address what is being uncovered through this Mo Ibrahim Index.
Okay, let's talk about South.
6th of December, in the afternoon, evening sometime, the Electoral Commission came out with a statement that the people, they can only vote in the presidential election. Those people had been part of the Hohoe constituency, and basically they were prevented from voting in that constituency. Now, when we took the matter up, the Attorney General's position, initially we took it up in the High Court as a human rights matter because their right to vote, they've been deprived of their right to vote, and we are all aware the right to vote is so fundamental in a democracy. We took it up in the High Court. The High Court granted an injunction ex parte based on the urgency of the situation, and the constitutional provisions do not provide a ceiling, by the way. There's no ceiling, but
the minimum.
But I want to go back. The Domelevo, we must all be clear that these issues about caseload, I see many judges in the courts below, the courts like the High Court, also talk about caseload. The idea of asking for a stay of execution of a ruling of the Speaker, there is really no legal basis for a stay of execution of a ruling of the Speaker. The court, the Supreme Court and other courts, have the authority to stay execution of decisions within the court system.
Okay.
But you don't apply for a stay of execution of something that happens within another arm of government, which is the arm of the Speaker. Now, the impression was given that because this is a matter for interpretation and so on, therefore you can run to the court. But again, there are clear decisions of the courts themselves, including the Supreme Court, decisions which make it absolutely clear that you don't, under the guise of interpretation, take to the Supreme Court things that are within the preserve of other courts or other authorities in the system. Very clear decisions. And I think we have to have a little law class here because, because I like some of these passages from the decisions of the Supreme Court itself, to be laid out for all of us to look at, because all of us have a responsibility to protect what is in the Constitution. The Supreme Court is not a law unto itself, fortunately. Neither is the Speaker a law unto himself. We all have responsibilities. So when, for instance...
Would you then say that the Supreme Court erred in that?
Well, definitely, in many respects. In fact, as I will try to perhaps explain if there is time, it erred in multiple respects. As I said, in the first respect, just running and saying there's a matter of interpretation, therefore Supreme Court, I'm before you, is not acceptable. The courts have said in many cases, as this case, for instance, Edriamwa and Chum, where it was stated, Aqua, the Justice of the Supreme Court, as he then was, makes the point that all courts, tribunals, institutions, and all individuals are bound by the provisions of the Constitution in the adjudication of disputes before them. In summary, then, whereas the original jurisdiction to interpret and enforce the provisions of this Constitution is vested solely in the Supreme Court, every court and tribunal is duty-bound or vested with jurisdiction to apply the provisions of the Constitution in the adjudication of disputes before it. And this jurisdiction is not taken away merely by a party's reference to or reliance on a provision of the Constitution. So just running to court and saying, Supreme Court, I want you to interpret such and such for me, does not mean that the Supreme Court should go ahead and do that. The Supreme Court has to decide whether it has jurisdiction. And I'll give you another example of something that
But I thought that interpretation of the Constitution is the exclusive jurisdiction of the Supreme Court.
Yes, but the court itself has made it clear that that does not take away the responsibility of others to apply the Constitution. Every institution, every court in the land applies the Constitution. Right. In applying it, they have to understand it. They have to interpret it in that sense. So the courts have made it quite clear that when you talk about the exclusive jurisdiction to interpret, it is not everything about some provision of the Constitution that leads to the requirement of interpretation. Put on this into having appointments made. And I say the Chief Justice because she had initiated a memo to the President as far back as in February in which she was trying to use the caseload justification and so on and so forth. So in the end, the Judicial Council said, no, let's halt. It's close to elections. Let the new president come and consider this. And I think that was the right position that the Judicial Council took. I think it would have looked really, unfair and misused, frankly, of the powers of the president.
So should we put a cap on the number of judges, Supreme Court judges?
I don't think it's necessary to have a formal cap. There are things that people should not require a strict legal sort of instrument or a strict constitutional provision before they go according to them. I think that we sometimes overemphasize what can be achieved through changing the law or reviewing something in the Constitution. Some of the time, the problems we're dealing with are just problems of poor governance by people who have been elected to certain offices or have been appointed to certain offices and who are expected to use their judgment in ways that are beneficial to the national interest. If they don't do that, it's not the law that is at fault. It's not the provisions in the Constitution that are at fault. It is the people. We should hold them accountable. That should be our first point of reference. Of course, there are things that may require modification and so on in the Constitution, and there's been a whole review committee set up, and they've come up with recommendations which, have still not been really looked at closely. But I think sometimes these arguments about Constitution being reviewed and so on, they make us lose sight of the sheer failures of leaders to do the right thing in the interest of the people. I think we should really hold leaders accountable for doing the right thing. And, it's not enough just to say the president has too much power in the Constitution, so let's limit their power. What is it that you believe they've done? The Attorney General went to the Supreme Court to have that injunction set aside based on the argument that we should not have gone before a human rights court, but we should have gone with an election petition before the High Court. And that is what the Supreme Court decided, that we should have gone by way of an election petition. So we started an election petition. And again, I mean, it's very sad to say some of these things, but it's the truth. Even getting the election petition served on Honorable Amau was a whole issue in itself. A bailiff of the High Court who was actually beaten to pulp, in connection with trying to serve this. But anyway, the main point about why they have not, up to now, been, allowed a correction of the situation is because on the part of the Attorney General, the position was initially taken, and the Attorney General went to Parliament to say this. He said that the people should have voted in the Boem.
Said that the executive and the judiciary were working together to frustrate the business of Parliament through some things like what's happening with the anti-gay bill in Parliament and whatnot.
I'm not aware of exactly what the Speaker of Parliament said in relation to, what you are describing, and I don't easily go in for conspiracy theories.
Okay.
So until I know exactly what was being said, I'm not able to comment on that. What I have been insistent on, as you will have heard me emphasize, is that whether it's the executive, whether it's Parliament, whether it's the Supreme Court, we must all be intent on examining their conduct in the light of the Constitution.
All right.
And what the Constitution requires each of them to do. Where they each fall short, they need to be held to account. And they need to be held to account by us, the citizens.
Okay, but what do you make of the president blocking the transition of the bill to him?
Well, again, the rules of Parliament are clear about the processes for bills being sent to the president and so on. If those processes are followed and the president refuses to accept a bill, of course that's not in line with what the Constitution's clear language requires. But as I say, I don't know the circumstances. And, I don't like to speak out of turn about things that I don't have the full facts on.
That's fine.
In terms of the procedure for bills being sent from Parliament to the president, it's very clear-cut. The president doesn't have a discretion when bills have been, passed by Parliament. He doesn't have a discretion whether to accept or not to accept. He has certain powers in terms of whether he wants a reconsideration and how he can refer matters to Council of State and so on and so forth, and even let it go back to the Parliament for them to reconsider. He has those opportunities, but he can't just refuse. He in respect of any bill.
Can have other Supreme Court, which is 9 plus the Chief Justice. The Chief Justice, like many predecessors, have said that there's a caseload at the Supreme Court. And so you have cases like the Domelovo case and that of the COVID restrictions, which they eventually ruled were unconstitutional acts by the president. But there was nothing that could have been done about it because the harm has already been done. Will you support a constitutional amendment to increase the ceiling of the number of Supreme Court judges? Because as it stands, we do not have it.
The Supreme Court at the moment.
Medafo se wo hu ensem ni dede bia ebitwa gu e social media ne so. Na emom no pe de ye no kure ankasa de a ene mesiro so be subscribe to your YouTube channel no. Eye The Punch TV. The Punch TV. Me a subscribe button no se hu hia me ye pa. Se de be ensem bi e be circulate o media ne so no. Eba na e post ya unsu be na notification. Na wanya bi ahye e de ama me. Mesro se wo be share video ama foforo enya bi ahye. Obi wa amanone anase Ghana ha krampo a obetimi enya bi ahwe e de ama me afen so ma we mfi se wo be like o comment a eye wadwenkyere no so ja no comment section e fa ma me na mi timi mekenkan emfa emam de o pesa wo twire bi a wo de twire to no ba be kenkan ne kama e de ama o channel ni din e de The Punch TV yankasa so ye frame a kyere broni makraw